Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my running back tier list for the 2019 fantasy football season. Now, before we begin today's video, I want to remind all of you who haven't clicked that subscribe button, click the subscribe button, join the community, as I am making fantasy football content here on my YouTube channel for the entirety of the 2019 fantasy football season. If you want to stay up to date and know when my latest video comes out, click that bell notification button. Much appreciated for the support. Now, also, other ways to support the channel, go over to my Patreon or down in the description, go check out my information on how to acquire my 2019 fantasy football draft guide. Whether it's PayPal or Patreon, there are two ways of getting it. The description has all of the information that you may be interested in, so go and check that out. Much appreciated. For all of you who have already supported the channel via Patreon, there's 55 of you guys currently. Much appreciated. Thank you very much. Letting the channel continue to grow and getting us going in the right direction. Okay, so let's talk about the running back position in this tier list that I'm going to be presenting. Now, there are a couple key differences between high tier and lower tier running backs. Now, in my opinion, something that I've been talking about endlessly throughout last season and going into this season, and for those of you who have picked up my 2019 fantasy football draft guide, I mention it there all the time. There are three main factors of what makes a really good running back. In my opinion, it's targets and your usage in the passing game, especially for those of you who play in PPR. If you don't play in PPR, then I'm sorry. But targets, opportunity in the red zone, and whether or not you play in an RBBC and whether you have the full backfield to yourself. Now, I kind of wanted to give you guys a visual description of how that works. So let's go ahead and check that out. So I have this here Venn diagram that kind of throws me back to good old school days. But just to kind of give you guys some perspective on what I'm talking about. Okay, so on the bottom in the yellow, we have red zone opportunity, whether that's rushing attempts or targets in the red zone. Running backs that are given this opportunity have a pretty good chance of succeeding in fantasy football because touchdowns are an extremely valuable commodity. On top of it, to the right of us, we have opportunity itself. Now, what exactly does that mean? That means playing time. Whether you're playing in an RBBC or you given enough touches on a weekly basis, that's what opportunity goes for. Like, give you an example. As of right now, the 49ers backfield looks like a running back by committee. Yes, you have Tevin Coleman, you have Jerick McKinnon, you have Matt Breida, you have Jeff Wilson Jr., you have Raheem Mostert. There are so many running backs there. How do we know who's going to have the full opportunity? Is there going to be a player out of that backfield that touches the ball enough to kind of break away from the group? That's what I'm talking about. I want to give you a difference between a guy like Christian McCaffrey, who nobody is touching snaps away from him, comparatively to other backfields around the National Football League that just have a plethora of running backs in a rotation. And the last thing on the very top, we have targets. It's extremely essential, especially in PPR formats, that you have running backs that have the ability to receive the ball out of the backfield. Now, I know there are many running backs in the National Football League that unfortunately aren't given as many targets as others, but there are some guys that live off of targets, and it's extremely essential in terms of fantasy, especially full PPR, to have a running back that can produce in this way. Now, there are obviously some intersecting points here. If there's a running back that is great in the red zone, or at least is given opportunity in the red zone, and gets a ample amount of targets, those end up typically being third down backs, similar to guys like James White, Tariq Cohen, Nyheim Hines, Chris Thompson, Austin Eckler. Last year, who else is there? That's a pretty good amount of names. Guys like that. That's who I'm talking about, who intersect in that division. Now, there's also guys that have the red zone opportunity and they have majority of the opportunity in their potential backfield. Guys like Chris Carson, Derrick Henry, Sony Michel, and then potentially Mark Ingram, Peyton Barber this coming year. These are guys that are considered RB2/3s because they're never really going to get targets in the National Football League. Their teams respectively have other options to pass the ball to, and they don't have to ask them to be three down backs. And then the last intersecting point, or the second to last, we have upside RB2s. Now, what exactly does that mean? Now, I'm talking about guys that are going to have the backfield predominantly to themselves and are going to have a lot of red zone are going to have a lot of work in the passing game. Guys like Devontae Freeman, guys like Aaron Jones, yes, these guys are going to get majority of the work out of their backfield and they're going to have an ample amount of targets. But because of how diverse their offense is and how much those respective teams like the Falcons and the Packers like to pass the ball, unfortunately, these running backs aren't going to get over the hump into the RB1 conversation because of their respective teams not really running the ball very much in the red zone and giving them enough opportunity to have double-digit touchdowns potentially. And in the final tier, sitting in the middle, it's the holy grail. It's the running backs that we all want, guys that are going off the board within the first 6 picks of our drafts. These are the McCaffreys, the Kamaras, Barkley, Elliott, David Johnson. Goodness, it's just there's a pretty solid amount of these guys. There are more for sure when we'll go over them, but just giving you a perspective, these guys do it all. They work in the red zone. They get opportunity as solo backs in their own backfield, and they're guys that are getting targets and a lot of receptions throughout the regular season. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's break this down really quickly. So just to kind of give you perspective before we begin, okay, what makes these top tier guys so good? Let's go ahead. Let's reveal this tier 1, shall we? And it's pretty obvious, right? This is our tier 1 as of right now. Kamara, McCaffrey, and Saquon. Until Ezekiel Elliott signs, he can't be really thrown into this division. You'll see him a little bit later, but for as of right now, Ezekiel Elliott, we don't know what he's going to do. He's been offered the second highest paid contract in terms of a running back for the NFL as of right now. I think just slightly behind Todd Gurley's contract. If he, goes ahead and accepts it, obviously he's going to be a tier 1 back this coming season. Now, before we continue anymore, I just want to give you guys a little more information. The tier list has no rankings. It is not in a particular order. So if you just look at the top 3, right? I have Saquon as my number 1, but he's sitting over there, right? Like, I didn't really care. I just threw guys in tiers because it really doesn't matter which one of the 3 you're taking. Just understand that these group of guys, they're really close in terms of value going into our 2019 seasons, okay? So also, a thing that I kind of wanted to mention, these guys get more red zone opportunity than just about anybody in the National Football League. Last year, and I've mentioned this a couple of times, the top 6 running backs in terms of, or top 6 to 7 running backs in terms of red zone opportunity were typically guys that ended pretty well in fantasy. Like the number 1 running back, Todd Gurley had 64 total rushing attempts in the red zone, which led to 17 touchdowns. That makes a pretty big difference. Now, Todd Gurley's not in this top 3, but guys like Alvin Kamara had a total of 51 attempts for 13 rushing touchdowns. Saquon had 50 attempts for 7 rushing touchdowns, and McCaffrey had the 4th most with 46 attempts for 7 rushing touchdowns. So these guys, all 3 of these guys were in the top 4 of total red zone rushing attempts, and they found themselves a lot of touchdowns. That's not even counting the amount of targets and receptions they respectively had, which just throws it into another dimension. But again, these 3, they're the top 3. They're the top tier wide receiver, wide receiver. Gosh, they're the top tier running back, and it's undisputable at this point. These guys are the top tier because of their opportunity, because no one else is contending to take too much stats away from them. I understand Latavius Murray does exist there, but Alvin Kamara, even with that, with Mark Ingram in the backfield, with Latavius Murray this coming season, the last 2 years, 2017, 2018, the guy has been a top 4 running back in half-point PPR scoring formats each of the last 2 years. So I don't think that's going anywhere because of Latavius Murray's presence. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about my next tier of running backs here, shall we? Let's click this and that's not the right button. There we go. Let's go ahead and show this, okay? So like I mentioned, we were going to see Zeke sooner or later. So here's the thing. Ezekiel Elliott should be in that tier 1. But until he signs, I have to move him a little bit. He has to move, because if there's any chance that he misses potential games, as of right now, there's not a clear indication of whether he does so or not, but you just have to be safe. But then the other 2 running backs, guys that have done it consistently throughout their career thus far. Todd Gurley, a guy that in the last 2 seasons has been the top running back in fantasy, scoring over 40 total touchdowns. You have a guy like David Johnson. Yes, he struggled last year, but in 2016, the guy was the number 1 running back, had one of the best seasons in fantasy football history in terms of total yardage, 20 plus touchdowns. The guy was insane. So these guys, respectively, within their offenses, within the opportunities that they're getting, targets, opportunity within their own backfield and red zone opportunity, these guys, they're the tier 2 of the running back position going forward. Let's go ahead and move on. Let's go ahead and bring down this here list, and let's talk about tier 3. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more interesting, right? We have guys that are pretty young. I mean, a majority of these running backs that are being taken in the first round kind of look like this, right? These are the top guys. This is, at least right now, a pretty good majority of them, right? 10 of the top 12 running backs, respectively. But here's the thing. Le'Veon Bell, I can't find myself putting him in that tier 2 region in this kind of perspective because of the fact that I don't know whether or not this Jets offense is going to help him enough to make him that viable fantasy prospect that he's been in prior years. From what we saw James Conner, who is similarly on this tier list, do last year, I mean, is there a possibility that the running back for the Steelers is just a product of the system? We saw Jalen Samuels even last year when James Conner was down be able to produce. I mean, behind one of the best offensive lines in the NFL and an offense that is going to move the ball because of the elite wide receiver play and the quarterback play that they have. There's so much potential that I don't know if Le'Veon Bell was just a product of that system. And we're not going to be able to tell until this coming year. Now, I have my gripes with Adam Gase's offenses, but I don't know, man. It's a little tricky there. Moving on to these other fellows. I've talked at a pretty good extent about Nick Chubb. If you haven't checked out my Nick Chubb video, go check that out. A lot of details on him. James Conner, another guy within a great offense as the lead back, and Joe Mixon. All three of these guys coming out of the AFC North, interestingly enough. They're all going to be great running backs. They were last season, and they're going to continue to just improve upon that. These are three guys that aren't being heavily contested in terms of rushing attempts with other potential backs until perhaps Kareem Hunt comes back. But even then, I don't potentially think that that's going to make a big difference on Nick Chubb's production. But those three guys, again, these are going to be guys worked in the red zone, going to see a fair share of targets, to be honest. Even though you might not think that James Conner or Nick Chubb are receiving backs, they're going to get a pretty fair amount. And James Conner was pretty good at the backfield last year for these Steelers. I mean, just as good as Le'Veon Bell. I know many people will be thinking that Le'Veon Bell is practically a receiver at the running back position, but still, James Conner was still able to produce with the opportunity that he was given. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about this next tier of the running back position. Now we get to a point where it gets a little bit of a fringe set of guys. The opportunities that these guys have are slightly different. Kerryon Johnson has guys like C.J. Anderson, Zach Zenner behind him, potentially vying for opportunity out of this backfield. And from what we were able to see last year with the use of LeGarrette Blount, the Detroit Lions don't want to have a singular back dominating the entire backfield. Now I understand they got rid of Theo Riddick. If you went and checked out my must-draft video, I talked extensively about what kind of potential Kerryon Johnson has, especially if Theo Riddick is not in that backfield. He's got a lot of it, especially because he's a great receiving down back. But because of the fact that C.J. Anderson is still there and he's going to be taking potentially 7 to 8 rushing attempts a game away from Kerryon Johnson, he just gets a little bit lower on this list. The thing about Dalvin Cook that I've mentioned in the past, Dalvin Cook sits behind a pretty washed offensive line in an offense that is going to throw the ball, but his injury history in the past has pretty much diminished his value in terms of fantasy because we don't know exactly what he's capable of. We've seen him throughout his career have some successful games here and there, especially once he came back from injury last season. But if he can't stay healthy and stay on the field, that is going to be an issue, and that's why he's continuing to drop in leagues. This is a guy that can be used as a 3-down back, can see majority of the usage in the red zone, but because of how their offense works, I expect to see a lot of the red zone plays coming out of Minnesota going towards Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen and Kyle Rudolph rather than just being handed straight off to Dalvin Cook potentially. And then there's always the chance that Alexander Madison starts to work in and take carries, similar to what Latavius Murray has done in the last couple of years. Moving on, the last running back of this tier, Damian Williams. Damian Williams, as of right now, coming off of that hamstring injury that he sustained this offseason, he's competing with Carlos Hyde and Darwin Thompson. Now, from what I've been able to hear, Carlos Hyde has been already taken over by Darwin Thompson on the depth chart. Darwin Thompson is starting to take first-team snaps. And the way it looks, it's probably going to be a split between Damian Williams and Thompson going forward. Now, Damian Williams has a significant experience edge over the rookie prospect, but from what Damian Williams was able to produce last year, and if you haven't checked out that video, I mean, I'm telling you guys, I've talked about literally every running back so far, but if you haven't checked out that video, the trust or bust, there's a lot of compelling stats in the direction that, there's going to be a pretty good season out of Damian Williams this year. All right, moving on. Let's see here, shall we? What am I clicking on? I completely forgot. Here we go. Let's talk about this next tier running back. Now, similar to this last tier, we have running backs that are in that fringe area. Now, what does that mean? Similar to, like I mentioned, Aaron Jones and Devontae Freeman. These are both guys that, as of right now, they're going to get work in the passing game. They're going to get opportunity out of their respective backfields. It's not going to be a running back by committee, but they're not going to have as much red zone opportunity as other running backs. These guys aren't going to see 10-plus touchdowns consistently. They're not going to have those 20 touchdown seasons. These guys are going to be in the conversation for high-end RB2s, but they're not going to be able to get over that hump because their respective offenses don't want to run the ball very much. Again, like I've mentioned in the past, Aaron Jones, part of the Packers offense. Last year, the Packers ran the ball the least amongst all NFL teams, and the Atlanta Falcons last year passed the ball nearly 65% of the time, and they barely ran the ball. Tevin Coleman, I think, had 162 rushing attempts total, and he was a starting back of that team. So really, they don't want to run the ball too much there. Obviously, they'll adjust. Those teams will continue to run the ball more going into this season because they need to balance up their offense. But looking at their potential opportunity, they're just a little bit lower in terms of value. And both of those guys are coming off of season-ending injuries, the groin injury for Freeman and the knee injury for Aaron Jones. So we got to be a little wary about that. Also, in the middle of them, we have Melvin Gordon. Now, Melvin Gordon should be a tier 3 running back, plain and simple, maybe even tier 2 from what he's been able to produce in his career thus far. But because he's on a holdout, he will drop. He will drop significantly lower because the reports have come out that he doesn't mind missing time during the season. He wants a contract. He's been offered that $10 million a year, and he's not interested in it. He thinks he needs to be paid more. And the Chargers truly think that they can continue without him, and they're going to address that and move forward without him with guys like Austin Eckler and Justin Jackson, and they're going to be okay with it. So whether or not Melvin Gordon shows up, they're going to lace up and they're going to play that first week, and we'll see how that goes against Indianapolis, if I'm not mistaken. So moving on to the next tier of running backs here, what do we got? All right, so here we go. Now we're starting to get a lot more running backs into this conversation. Now, a lot of these guys begin to be, instead of so tiers 1 through 4, a lot of these guys had opportunity to be an overall all-around great running back. Have all three facets, whether it's targets, opportunity in terms of the snaps per game and RBBC, and red zone work. All four of those divisions up there, all of those guys have a pretty good opportunity to being one of those top 12 running backs. There's 13 guys up there. So a lot of those guys have really good opportunity. Now that we've moved down to 5 and 6, a lot of these running backs tend to have only two of the main categories proficiently, right? So talking about Chris Carson and Marlon Mack and Sony Michel, Leonard Fournette, Josh Jacobs, and Mark Ingram going into 2019, these guys are probably not, let's think about it, right? Carson, Mack, and Michelle, they're not going to really see too many targets. Now, I know there's been information, we're going to get more targets to Chris Carson. We're going to see more targets to Leonard Fournette. These guys aren't going to be receiving back. These are going to be guys that are going to work heavily in the red zone, are going to get a lot of the red zone or just regular rushing opportunities for their respective teams. And they're going to be that RB2, RB3 fringe kind of players. And that's where they sit at this division. Now, we have guys like Josh Jacobs who, as of right now, could potentially see a lot of work in the passing game. But we don't know what kind of an offense this is going to be and whether they're even going to get to the red zone, much less be able to hand this man the opportunity to score there, right? So that's why he sits at this number 6 tier range. Now, Mark Ingram, he's been pretty consistent in his career in the passing game. Even when Alvin Kamara came in 2017, Mark Ingram set career highs in receiving yards and receptions. So this guy is a pretty capable back out of the backfield, but the Ravens are not going to run the ball. They're not going to run the ball. Andrew, think. They're not going to pass the ball. They're going to run the ball heavily. And then if they want to pass the ball, sure, every now and then, short, out of the backfield, dump offs either to Mark Ingram or any of the other running backs out of this backfield, potentially even Justice Hill going into the future. But this is not a guy that's going to see a lot of targets. That's why he kind of sits around this range rather than anywhere higher. So these guys, they are taking advantage of 2 of the main 3 aspects of being one of these top tier backs. And there's always a potential that, Leonard Fournette could see 60 targets and catch the ball 45 times this year. And same thing with Chris Carson or Marlon Mack. But as of right now, when they have guys like Rashad Penny, Nyheim Hines, James White behind them respectively, those 3, they're a little bit less valued. Now, all of these guys have produced, except for Josh Jacobs because he's a rookie in the NFL. So we kind of have a pretty good idea of where they're going to pretty much lay out by the end of 2019 in terms of production, as long as they stay healthy. So that's why they sit around this tier 6 range. All right, let's go ahead. Let's move on here. Here we go. Okay, so now talking about this tier 7. Here is when we get to the running back by committee situations. Phillip Lindsay, man, it's pretty unfortunate. Phillip Lindsay last year was fantastic. He was a top 12 running back in half PPR, but the issue is that he wasn't even given a fair share in terms of total rushing attempts. The guy just was kind of screwed over there. If I'm not mistaken, the stat was he only played 45% of offensive snaps last season, and he was the number 12 running back in fantasy in half PPR. Because of the fact that they want to use Royce Freeman and Devontae Booker out of this backfield, and they kind of want to keep that rotation going, Phillip Lindsay's not going to have as much upside as these other guys because he's not going to be given as much opportunity respectively. He's in an RBBC situation. Same thing with Tevin Coleman. Now, Tevin Coleman and Phillip Lindsay, these are guys that are going to be great out of their backfield because they can catch the ball, because they can get work in the red zone. But because of their situations in terms of how many mouths there are to feed out of this backfield, it becomes a little tricky. Same thing with David Montgomery next to Tevin Coleman. Same thing with Kenyon Drake. Kenyon Drake is sitting in a pretty tough scenario as of right now. Similar to last season. Last season he saw less rushing attempts than Frank Gore, for the love of God. Now going into this season, he's injured. Kalen Ballage has looked good throughout training camp. Even though I 100% believe Kenyon Drake is a better running back, they might split snaps, which could hurt his fantasy potential come 2019. Let's go ahead. Let's scroll this sucker down. Let's see this next tier, right? And kind of give you the comparison, right? Comparatively from 7 to 8, there's a pretty big difference in my eyes. I feel like even though these guys are a part of committees, they're going to touch the ball in the receiving game enough and get enough red zone potential opportunity to where they are a little bit more, in my opinion, valued than the guys below them. Now, guys like James White, especially Austin Eckler, if in fact Melvin Gordon doesn't play, Tariq Cohen, these are guys that are primarily just third down receiving backs that can contribute in the run game. Absolutely, they have in the past, but they're primarily known as receiving options for their respective teams. Now, as of right now in their respective tier, I feel like if in fact these guys are going to be dialed back potentially, Tariq Cohen, there's always that looming idea that Matt Nagy the other day was saying, Tariq Cohen, we used him too much last year. We're going to have to dial it back down and potentially give David Montgomery more attempts in the passing game. Well, if that's a potential, well, you just have an RBBC on your hand. That's literally what it's going to be. You have Mike Davis already there. You have David Montgomery coming in from the draft. Tariq Cohen, all of their productions are contingent on whether or not they stay healthy and whether they can produce. So it just makes it tough in that respective backfield. Moving on to guys like James White, again, another RBBC there, and him being just a primarily, a receiving back. If you have to deal with Sony Michel taking majority of the rushing attempts, and then you have Rex Burkhead and Damien Harris there too, that hurts you. Austin Eckler's a little bit different because of the potential of him becoming the number one starter of his respective team. But still, even when he becomes a starter, Justin Jackson is going to be a guy splitting 60-40 with him and taking away some opportunity there. Now, looking at the other three, after these guys in Tier 8, we have Peyton Barber, we have Derrick Henry, and we have Lamar Miller. Now, these guys, they're going to get their rushing opportunities. They're never going to be touched in the passing game. And potentially they could have red zone opportunities. Now, as of right now, I'm extremely low on Derrick Henry. I think it's just a facade. It's a couple good games into some really good matchups last year. 2 specifically good games. A 50-point fantasy point game is obviously going to bring up your averages. That's not something that we can count upon every year. And I don't want a 50-point game if the other weeks you're putting up only 6 points per game. Right? So that's why he sits as low as he does. Peyton Barber was absolutely terrible last year, but he still is the starting running back of his respective team. He's a guy that's going to touch the ball potentially 200 times this year. That's why he's in this division. Now, because he doesn't get any work in the passing game, and really his red zone opportunity is not going to be great considering this team wants to pass the ball heavily, again, we have to adjust and accordingly decrease his value, similar to a guy like Lamar Miller. So just kind of putting that in perspective. And also Lamar Miller, I mean, he's really not going to get any passing work either. Now that they've brought Duke Johnson, and Duke Johnson's going to dominate all of that passing work potential that he could have had and Alfred Blue was taking last year. All right, moving on to this next division, or tier, excuse me. These are the handcuffs with upside. Rashad Penny, Royce Freeman, Latavius Murray. Those 3 guys, I mean, even Kalen Ballage, even Matt Breida, even Adrian Peterson, those guys are all going to be in a running back by committee situation, in the idea that their team either likes to run the ball a lot or they're going to get a good amount of touches to keep them fantasy relevant. Now, we know how much the Seattle Seahawks run the ball. Therefore, Rashad Penny is going to be a viable option in fantasy because of that. Now, whether or not he sees any of the red zone work, that is, to be seen. Because honestly, I think Chris Carson is going to get all the red zone opportunity. If Chris Carson dominates the passing game, or at least splits it 50-50 with the potential of Rashad Penny or CJ Prosise out of that backfield, or JD McKissick, whatever receiving back they want to use in Seattle, that could hurt him. Royce Freeman, yes, you might be getting a little bit more opportunity this coming season, but are you that much better than Phillip Lindsay? I expect Phillip Lindsay to pretty much drown him out again. He's still going to get his 150 potential touches this coming season just running the ball, which is going to keep him relevant, especially in an offense that loves to run the ball behind a good offensive line. Latavius Murray joining an offense, and he's basically moving into that Mark Ingram situation. It's a guy that honestly is going to touch the ball upwards of 8 to 12 times a game, and it's going to have a pretty decent floor there because even last season, Mark Ingram was able to produce nearly 10 fantasy points per week in half PPR, just being a backup running back to Alvin Kamara there. And then we have Kalen Ballage, like I mentioned before, has a pretty good opportunity to be the starting running back of this team, or at least split carries with Kenyon Drake because of his injury and because of the opportunity that he's been getting this offseason. Adrian Peterson, until Darius Guice is 100%, is a guy that ran for 1,000 yards last season, had over 10 touchdowns. So it's another guy that, as a starting running back of his respective team, sure, he's going to have to split some snaps out of that backfield with Chris Thompson and Darius Guice coming back, but he's still a guy that's in a committee that has value. Matt Breida, similar to Tevin Coleman, just splitting that backfield. Both guys are potential, receiving threats, and who's going to be able to, collect all of the red zone work? We'll just have to wait and see. Miles Sanders, the next guy over. Philadelphia's potential running back of the future. That's what we're assuming he's going to be. As of right now, Philadelphia backfield and anything that Doug Peterson has done with the running back since he's joined the Philadelphia offense has been depressing. There hasn't been a running back to run over 1,000 yards, have over 10 touchdowns, or even have over 200 rushing attempts in Doug Peterson's tenure with the Philadelphia Eagles. So can we trust a guy like Miles Sanders to produce? I don't think so, but I think he's going to be one of these fringe options here, down here at tier 9, that will be able to produce potentially as a flex in a good matchup throughout the season. And then we have LaShawn McCoy, the guy that is literally in charge of one of the biggest RBBCs in the National Football League, with guys like TJ Yeldon, Frank Gore, and Devin Singletary out of that backfield. There's a lot of mouths to feed. And whether or not LaShawn McCoy at his age can sustain it, only time will tell. But, from what we saw last season, because of the negative game scripts of the Buffalo Bills, it was extremely difficult for this team to run the ball, and especially because their offensive line play was not great. So can LaShawn McCoy in 2019 find, the fountain of youth? I think he's going to be the starting running back of this team, and I think there is always a potential that because of the offensive improvements they've made, whether it's up front, the quarterback, or the receiving play, by proxy, he can have more opportunity and act upon it and potentially be a guy that puts up 700-800 total yards, but not too many touchdowns, not too many receptions as he's gotten older. His usage is going to go down as the years go on. Whether or not he's going to get traded, that's a different conversation, but we'll see. All right, the last tier. We have Dion Lewis, we have Darius Geis, Ito Smith, Darrell Henderson, we have Justice Hill, Jordan Howard, Justin Jackson, Duke Johnson. Guys that they have, or they're going to have, potential opportunity in their backfields. They're not going to prevent their starters from having clear reign, but they could potentially find themselves a niche in their offense that helps them produce. Now, what does that mean? Dion Lewis was a third down receiving back for that team, and because of the negative game scripts that the Tennessee Titans faced for a majority of last season, Dion Lewis had to be used at a pretty extensive amount, and that's what drowned out Derrick Henry throughout majority of the first 12 games of the season. Darius Geis, a guy that, yes, is coming back from injury. We haven't seen him play since his time at LSU. Is he going to be healthy? Is he going to be able to finally transition and at least get a decent work load going into 2019? I don't think that's the case because there is an Adrian Peterson there, and why give too many attempts to Darius Geis when you can just run Adrian Peterson into the ground and just keep Darius Geis healthy going forward? Because they spent a pretty good amount. They spent a pretty penny on him in the draft, so you might as well keep your investment a little bit safer than usual if you have another respective back there that can contribute. Ito Smith, going to fill into that Tevin Coleman role. Darrell Henderson could potentially see some touches here or there because of Todd Gurley and them trying to scale back some of the attempts that he got. A guy like Justice Hill going into that Ravens backfield, a team that loves to run the ball, a guy that's going to have to contribute as time moves on in the season. Jordan Howard, sure. As I mentioned, Doug Peterson's offense, nobody's run the ball over 200 times. That's typically because they run a running back by committee. They're just going to hand off the ball to respective running backs. Sure, Jordan Howard is never going to be used in the running game, isn't an RBBC, but he could potentially be the goal line back of this team. Justin Jackson, a guy that if in fact Melvin Gordon does not play, is going to see 40% of that backfield opportunity, potentially even the goal line work for the Chargers, which he's been used in during the preseason and late last season with Austin Eckler on roster. And then Duke Johnson, the last guy, a guy that has been used in the passing game throughout his career and potentially can be used in the running game at a pretty good amount. If we go back and look at what Alfred Blue was given last year within this Texans offense, it's clear to see that the Texans don't want to give all of the touches to Lamar Miller. They want to spread it out. They gave Alfred Blue nearly 150 total rushing attempts last season, a good amount of targets, and that's something that Duke Johnson has a potential to act upon and make pretty good value out of in terms of fantasy. So, okay, we talked about this tier list. Hopefully that gives you a pretty good perspective. Obviously, none of this is in a particular order. This is just off the top of my head, just throwing names into tiers. If you like this content, please go down below, click that like button, subscribe to the channel, and if you have any comments, questions, concerns, go down to the comment section. I'm not going to tell you if I have Le'Veon Bell over Nick Chubb going into 2019, because then what's the point of having a draft guide? But if you you can probably figure it out over time. But anyway, thank you everybody for watching. This was fun. I always like tier lists. The thumbnail was funny. And hopefully you guys like this content. Let me know what you guys think. And until next time, much love. Thank you for the support, everyone. And I'll see you guys. Peace.